Welcome to the first supplementary lecture in statistics. This one is entitled Introduction to Sampling, Why Sampling Technique Matters. Before we start this lecture, let me just remind you that these lectures are supplementary. They're not intended to replace the textbook. In order to learn all that you need to know for the exams, for quizzes, for doing your group work, you'll want to be sure to read your textbook and work the problems there, as well as listening to these lectures. So does sampling really matter? The short answer is yes. Poor sampling is one of the most common flaws, especially in informal research. As a matter of fact, changing only the sampling technique can completely reverse the outcome of survey data. In fact, we'll tell a story of one time that it did and explain how it all went so sadly and badly wrong. There used to be a very popular newspaper advice column entitled Ann Landers. As a matter of fact, I think it still exists, though it doesn't have the readership that it once did. In this advice column, the author one time asked this question of her readership: if you had to do it over again, would you have children? There were over 10,000 write-in responses, so that the margin of error of this study was just under 1%. That means that we expect that about within 1% of the true proportion in the population, we would find out what percentage of parents would have children over again if they could choose. The result was stunning. 70% of Ann Landers' respondents said no, if we could choose over again, we would not have children. So, does that mean it's 70% sure that your mother doesn't love you? Well, maybe not. Intuitively, most of us know that something is terribly wrong here. But what is it? 10,000 responses is a lot of data. It is plenty to get good, accurate results. Secondly, the question was really quite simple, and Ann did not ask the question in a way that would lead readers toward the negative response, no, we wouldn't have children. Finally, the calculations were done correctly. So what's going on? Well, Ann used what is known as a voluntary response sample. In other words, people choose themselves either into or out of this kind of study. Voluntary samples almost always bias the results toward negative emotions. Now notice I did not say toward the no answer. Negative emotions could be associated with a yes or a no, a blue or a red, whatever the responses might be. But it's the negative emotions that we want to key in on. That tells us where voluntary response is likely to go. The reason for this is really quite simple in terms of psychology. Negative emotions are much more motivating than positive emotions are. So negative emotions motivate people to respond to the question. Now occasionally I'll have a student ask me, is that really true? I mean, there are some positive experiences that are very, very motivating for me. Well, of course there are. But we could think of this just in terms of biology. Suppose you're seated in a beautiful grassy meadow, lots of wildflowers around, sitting next to a stream, beautiful clear day in the summer, you're having a lovely experience, and you look up and suddenly you see a tiger who looks like it's stalking you. What do you think is going to be more motivating? The nice, warm feeling you got sitting under the lovely blue sky and the nice warm sun? Or this threat that looks like it may be interested in eating you? Well, I dare say it's that threat that's going to be motivating you to action. Even though you enjoyed the positive feelings a great deal, it's the negative emotions that motivate us to action. So when we're doing sample surveys or taking a sample of any kind, we should not ask for volunteers. Rather, the researcher should actively choose the sample. Now, this leads us to a critical design principle, and that is that no amount of calculation can fix bad design. No one made a mistake in counting or in computing the percentage of Anne's sample that said that they would rather that they had not had their children. The problem was in the design of the study. So is asking for volunteers really that bad? Well, the answer is yes, and we haven't got to the end of the story. The rest of the story proves it. There's a magazine known as Good Housekeeping Magazine, and it ran a follow-up story on Ann Landers' results. So they first ran the story about these amazing results, and then they decided to ask their readers the exact same question. If you had to do it over again, would you have children? This time, the results skewed in the exact opposite direction. 95% of the readers said, yes, we would have our children, versus 70% said no for Ann Landers. Now, wait a minute. This is exactly the same survey. The population of the readers is very similar. What's going on? Well, the intro story in Good Housekeeping gave negative emotions a new focus. And the focus would get put into words this way. How could so many people not want their children? Well, nobody wants to be among this group of people who are so corrupt as not to want their children, and so it swayed their answers in the direction of the yes answer, which is actually where the negative emotions are going. Furthermore, it was that negative emotion. All of these people don't want their children. They were motivated to try to tip the balance in the opposite direction. You see, people with strong feelings are most likely to respond in a voluntary response situation. So we should actively choose the sample, and we should make those choices randomly. That means we should choose in a way that every possible sample of the desired size is just as likely as every other one. When you choose in this way, you obtain what is called a simple random sample. Now, in our textbook, you'll often see that referred to as a random sample, but the proper statistical name for it is a simple random sample. What it means is there's really no structure at all. It's just completely random, those individuals from the population who are selected for the study. I should highlight this fact, though, that our textbook does not use the term simple random sample. Statisticians do, and if you spend some time reading studies, you will come across the term simple random sample. Our book always shortens that to random sample. So why is random sampling important? Random sampling prevents researchers from favoring some kind of individuals or outcomes over others. Favoring some outcomes over others is known technically as bias. Now, bias in this technical sense has no overtone of it being deliberate or nefarious in some way. Rather, bias, when it happens in real research, is almost always unconscious. But that's the power of randomness, in that it prevents bias, even if the bias is unconscious.